I want to bring the conversation back to the broken criminal justice system that is disproportionately negatively impacting Black and brown people all across this country today. Now, Senator Harris says she's proud of her record as a prosecutor and that she'll be a prosecutor president, but I'm deeply concerned about this record. There are too many examples to cite, but she put over 1,500 people in jail for marijuana violations and then laughed about it when she was asked if she ever smoked marijuana.
The United States is supposed to be a beacon of freedom. We're supposed to be the land of the free. So why is it that we incarcerate more people than any other country in the world? Why is it that one of the things that we're known for is how many people are in our prison system? It is the very nature of the liberal state and our liberal society that leads to this paradox. The way the founding fathers viewed the purpose of our government was to protect our individual rights. The reason that the government even has any authority or justification to exist is to protect freedom. But if the purpose of the government is to protect our rights, then what happens when one citizen takes away the rights of another? We're supposed to have freedom of speech. We're supposed to have property rights. And we're entitled to be safe, to pursue happiness how we see fit. So when one of those rights is threatened, the state has to intervene and do something to protect that right. Now, the liberal state is not in a position to prevent all crimes. The best that the liberal state can do is to deter people from committing crimes. And the only way the liberal state is able to deter crimes is by punishing people. And the way that the liberal state punishes people is it takes away their freedom. So this leads to the great paradox of liberalism. The role of the liberal government is to protect our rights and freedoms, while at the same time the goal of the liberal government is also to deny people's rights and freedoms. It's a paradox. One of the major features of the criminal justice system in the United States is what I would call the liberal arms race. The problem with the liberal paradox is the liberal state can very easily be criticized. It's hypocritical for the liberal state to be so obsessed with protecting freedom by denying other people their freedoms. It just doesn't make sense. And the way the liberal state responds to this criticism is by engaging in a liberal arms race. Basically, over time, the liberal state has given us more and more rights in procedural protections. And at the same time, the liberal state has grown more powerful and despotic over time. The reason that the liberal state keeps giving us more rights and privileges is to create an illusion in order to cover up the fact that it is growing increasingly more powerful, conducts increasing amounts of surveillance, and invades further into the private lives of its citizens. If you accuse the liberal state of being despotic, however, it will point to these additional rights and procedural protections as a veneer that the liberal state is in fact concerned about things like individual privacy. So while the liberal state will give us a jury trial where the state has to prove our guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, in turn, the liberal state gets a vast police force which it can deploy to deal with whatever problems the liberal state faces and to investigate crimes. While we get a right to an attorney if charged in a criminal case, the liberal state gets its own attorney, an aggressive prosecutor. While we get the right to privacy that protects us from the police just searching our property for no reason, the state gets the ability to obtain search warrants or subpoena our bank records. While we have the right to be read a Miranda warning if police are trying to interview us while we are in custody, the liberal state gets an ability to wiretap our phones if it follows the proper procedures. While we get the right to confront our accusers, the liberal state can use its subpoena power to force witnesses to testify even if they don't want to. There are two major reasons why the incarceration rate is so high in the United States. One of them is the liberal state, and one of them is the liberal society. So right now I'm going to talk about the liberal state. In the liberal state, we have what I would call obligatory justice. Whenever someone commits a crime that deprives someone of their rights, the liberal state is obligated to be responsive to that. So if someone denies someone else of their right to own property, right to personal safety, right to freedom of speech, then the liberal state must intervene and do something to address the violation of rights. Otherwise, the liberal state is not living up to its existential purpose. The only justification, according to liberals, for their government to exist is that it protects people's rights. The reason this leads to such a high incarceration rate is that the liberal state is constantly required to move forward on cases even when the victim of the alleged crime is not interested in prosecution. Now, I would contrast this with ancient Athens. Ancient Athens was not a liberal state. It was a democracy, but it had no concept of individual rights. And in ancient Athens, it was the victim themselves that would serve as a prosecutor in the case. The system that Athens had in place was very simple. There were no written laws, although there was a common tradition and culture that understood what crimes were. There was no judge, there were no lawyers. The victim would make their case during a trial to a jury. That jury often had hundreds, if not thousands, of members so that it accurately reflected the tradition and culture of the city. The jury would decide whether the defendant had committed a crime, and if so, they would determine the punishment by a vote of majority. There were no search warrants, no wiretaps, no vast police force, no prosecutor, no complicated laws that required attorneys. In Athens, if someone didn't want a crime prosecuted, it wouldn't be, because it was the obligation of the victim to be the prosecutor. Most of the violent crime in the United States is committed by an unsavory person against another unsavory person. So for example, a drug dealer may rob or shoot at another drug dealer. And oftentimes, the victims of these crimes want nothing to do with prosecution. They don't want to have to testify. They don't care if the person who victimized them goes to prison or not. In Athens, these cases would not result in convictions or incarcerations. But in the United States, because of liberalism, because of the obligation to protect people's rights, the prosecution will barrel forward. It will subpoena these victims and force them to testify even if they didn't want to. Another major problem with the liberal state is that it has a giant conflict of interest. The liberal state is supposed to ensure that people get a fair trial, while at the same time, it's responsible for making sure that people are deterred from committing crimes. The way the liberal state handles this is sky-high minimum sentences. With such high minimum sentences, any person who has committed a crime has a huge incentive to give up all the rights and procedural protections that they gained during the liberal arms race in order to receive a more lenient sentence than what they would get if they were convicted at trial, which is often astronomical. Now, if someone chooses not to avail themselves of the plea bargain and they take advantage of all those rights and procedural protections, and then that person does end up convicted, they're going to get absolutely hammered. And therefore, the liberal state gets the maximum amount of deterrence possible out of the system. This is the perfect system in place for the liberal state. It also leads to rather absurd situations. Now, I can give you a couple of examples of tragic injustice that happens all the time in the United States liberal criminal justice system. One example I'll give is, imagine that police find 3 people outside of a burglarized house. 2 of those people invoke their right to remain silent. The third person cooperates fully, admits that along with the 2 other individuals that they had gone and burglarized that house. This cooperating witness, who I will dub the sucker, ends up leading police to the place where all the stolen property was stashed. Now, in a situation like this, the 2 people who refuse to give a statement to police are going to walk away with a clean slate. There's no evidence implicating them. The statements of the cooperating witness cannot be used against them according to the law in the United States. Therefore, they will receive no punishment. Meanwhile, the person who admitted to participating in the burglary and who helped the police find the stolen items, that person will likely get completely hammered. They have very little chance of being acquitted at a trial because they confess to it. And they're likely to face a choice between a terrible plea agreement and going to trial where they will get absolutely hammered. Now, let me give you another example. Imagine undercover police end up busting an entire drug trafficking organization. The kingpin and the leadership of that organization quickly take plea deals because, let's face it, the evidence against them is going to be overwhelming. Now, during this investigation, it's also determined that one person had a very minor role in the whole operation. This guy just drove a truck on a single occasion from one location to another, and that truck had a bunch of drugs on it. That person may choose to go to trial and reject a plea agreement and try and argue that they didn't know there was any drugs in the truck. That person will likely, assuming they get convicted, receive a tougher sentence than the drug kingpin in charge of the entire operation. That is how the liberal justice system in the United States works. I compared earlier the United States to ancient Athens, but critics of the criminal justice system in the United States usually compare the United States to China. The theory is that China, being an authoritarian country, should lock up more people than the United States does. Critics always fail to point out that the liberal nature of the United States is, to a large degree, the cause of this problem, and instead they argue that the United States is just simply overly punitive. The reality is that China does not have this obligation to protect people's rights. It doesn't have to prosecute a case every time someone commits an act of violence. It can let cases go. In fact, what China cares most about is the growth of power of its own economy and national government. It has no reason to be overly concerned with what crimes poor people are committing against other poor people, and therefore it doesn't use its state resources to the degree that the United States does, because it's simply not obligated to. The issue isn't that the United States is more authoritarian than the government of China. It's just that the government of China doesn't feel as existentially obligated to protecting people's rights as the government in the United States does. I've talked about the liberal state and how it contributes to incarceration rate. And now it's time to talk about the other major factor that drives the U.S. incarceration rate, and that is the liberal society of the United States. The best way to discuss this phenomenon is to divide the United States into two time periods. The time period that existed before we had a liberal society and the time period that existed after. Traditionally, America did not have a liberal society, even though it always had a liberal state. In the traditional society, which lasted until the mid-1950s, Americans primarily based their culture and personal beliefs on what they learned in church or synagogue. The church or synagogue was the premier cultural institution for most of America's history. Americans would attend church growing up as children, and they would learn moral values and would be given advice on how to live lives as good Christians or good Jews. People who deviated from the lessons taught in church or lived alternative lifestyles would be shunned. This all changed in the late 1950s, early 1960s with the counterculture. The Beatniks, or as they would later be known, the hippies, were basically a group of liberalists that wanted to change society so that it was acceptable for individuals to do whatever they want and not be criticized for making choices that deviated from societal norms. The Beatniks and hippies preached unlimited sex, unlimited drugs, live life however you want, no judgment. The counterculture was a tremendous success at what it sought out to do. It completely destroyed the traditional culture of America and transformed us into a liberal society. In the new society, people could do whatever they want, live their lives however they want, and not be judged for it. When it comes to crime, you can see a major difference between how crimes were committed in pre-liberal America and how they were committed after the counterculture. You can see that clearly in just looking at the most infamous criminals of each era. So in the pre-liberal era, you had infamous criminals such as Al Capone in the Five Points Gang, Cosa Nostra, the Italian Mafia, the Barrow Gang, which Bonnie and Clyde were members of, the Ku Klux Klan, a massive criminal organization, and the Wild Bunch, which included Butch Cassidy. If you notice something, all these infamous criminals all happen to be members of groups. Now this shifts after America becomes a liberal society. No longer are the most infamous criminals large groups of people. Instead, they become disturbed individuals acting either by themselves or just with one or a few other people. And examples of infamous post-liberal criminals would include all the various serial killers, John Wayne Gacy, the Night Stalker, Jeffrey Dahmer, etc., Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, the Oklahoma City bombers, the numerous and endless amounts of people who commit mass shootings either by themselves or with one other person. You also have Lee Harvey Oswald, who shot JFK. All of these are disturbed individuals. In between the pre-liberal era and the post-liberal era, you have someone like Charles Manson, who sort of bridges the gap. He led a small group of disturbed individuals that killed the victims in their vicious murders. Now, in the pre-liberal society, someone's social standing would be of paramount importance. People in the pre-liberal society were members of church congregations, and a lot of times they would be members of various social groups, civic groups, things like labor unions, various lodges, bowling leagues, groups such as that. And in order to maintain all of those social connections and all of the advantages that came with that, one would have to make sure that their reputation was high amongst the group. That meant things like not drinking too much, not abusing substances too much, not engaging in crimes, not having even the reputation that someone was disreputable. You certainly wouldn't want to have a child out of wedlock. You wouldn't want to do things that deviated widely from the norms of your community and social group. If you did end up having a personal crisis, for example, you ended up beating your wife and gave her a black eye, or you started drinking too much or smoking too much marijuana, there would be an opportunity for other people you interacted with at church or in these other groups to intervene, to try and help you get back on the right path. And in that way, being a member of these civic groups would be one way to avoid the liberal state having to get involved at all in some of these social problems that contribute wildly to crime today. When America became a liberal society, the individual was free now to do whatever they wanted. So drinking as much alcohol as possible, having as much sex as possible, abusing all sorts of drugs, all became possible. People had sex out of wedlock, children out of wedlock. Of course, this all resulted in massive social problems, all of which have led greatly to increased crime in our country. Thomas Sowell, in his book Black Rednecks and White Liberals, indicates that when he grew up in the 1940s, people could sleep on their fire escapes or in Central Park when it was hot during the summer, and no one would be afraid of being robbed or victimized in any way. You compare that with today and you would have to be crazy to go to sleep in Central Park. Drug addiction rates before America became a liberal society were basically non-existent. Nobody abused drugs. This is true even though certain drugs, including marijuana and methamphetamine, were not even illegal at that time. Yet no one abused those drugs. The liberal state and liberal society, when combined, create the perfect storm for a hurricane of incarceration. Recently, there are people who have been advocates for criminal justice reform. These people think that they can solve the problem of mass incarceration without deviating from our liberal state or liberal society. I believe that any of these proposed criminal justice reforms are doomed to failure. The first I want to talk about is Donald Trump's First Step Act. The First Step Act was supposed to reduce prison populations. Well, how many people have been released early as a result of it? a total of 2,500. That's less than 0.001% of the prison population. So it's basically a drop in the bucket. A big part of the reason why it couldn't have had a larger effect is that it omitted violent criminals. Most of the people locked up in our prisons are violent criminals. If the liberal state went ahead and released all of the violent criminals, then it would create an existential crisis for itself, because the entire point of the liberal government, according to the philosophy of liberalism, is to protect people's rights. And it can't just release all of these violent criminals into society without neglecting its essential purpose. The other criminal justice reform effort has been to elect so-called progressive prosecutors. These are people such as Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, Eric Gonzalez in Brooklyn, and John Kruzau in Dallas, Texas. These progressive prosecutors are supposedly going to enact policies that will reduce the incarceration rate. I've followed some of the progressive prosecutors in the news cycle, and I don't think there's any evidence that any of them have meaningfully reduced prison population whatsoever. What seems to be happening is that these progressive prosecutors will issue press releases indicating that they have put in a drug diversion program for people who are found to be in possession of small amounts of drugs. The issue with this is that these diversion programs have existed for decades. They are not new, nor were they invented by these progressive prosecutors who pretend like this is some sort of new revolutionary idea that they came up with. When progressive prosecutors do actually try and reduce incarceration rate, they do so by focusing on very low-level offenses. This is, of course, completely ineffective at reducing the incarceration rate, because the vast majority of people who are incarcerated are not incarcerated for low-level offenses. So what ends up happening is the progressive prosecutors will stop enforcing low-level quality of life crimes. And all that ends up accomplishing is it makes their cities disgusting and obnoxious places to live. A perfect example of this can be seen in the Seattle is Dying news documentary made by Como News. The liberal state under progressive prosecutors in Seattle refuses to prosecute low-level offenses, and this leads to situations such as homeless tent encampments in every conceivable place all throughout the city. Feces and discarded syringes in parks, cemeteries, near schools, everywhere. The streets are filled with zombie-like people, homeless drug addicts that just sort of stutter around while ranting endlessly about complete nonsense. The city feels completely overwhelmed with these people. This is not a serious solution to the problem of sky-high incarceration rates caused by the liberal society and liberal state. And the only way to seriously reform these problems is to consider the fact that perhaps liberalism has failed, and perhaps basing an entire society and government completely around principles of liberalism is not going to work and not going to be successful. If you like this video, please subscribe.